this is the second programming concepts video. In this one, we're going to talk about variables. Variables are something that's important to all programming, in particular games, but certainly every program will have its variables, and we should understand how to use them. So variables are simply placeholders for values that can change in a program. Those values likely will change, and therefore we always call them variables. Variables need to have descriptive and meaningful names, and we give them descriptive and meaningful names because they represent something in our program, and therefore they should have a name that reflects what that value represents. In our games, we can keep track of certain aspects of the game, like the player's score, the player's lives, the level we're on, etc. There's a lot of different things we can keep track of with variables. Variables are useful for many, many things, so it's not like we're only going to use them for these things. We can use them for just about anything. So one of the other aspects of variables is the local variable versus the global variable. This is called scope. So the scope is either local or global, and what that means is that local variables only are accessible inside of something. What that means is wherever they're created, that is the place where you can access them, either physically in other programming languages. In our games, when we create a variable inside of an object, it belongs to that object, and therefore in order to access it, we need to either be working with that object or work through that object in another object. Another example is temporary variables. Those are hyperlocal variables. Those only work inside of the event we create them in, because we're only creating them for a short period of time, because we only need them for a short period of time. And if we are using the temporary variables, we simply want that for a short period of time, and then we're done with it. So temporary variables are something that are like hyperlocal. They're really limited in where they're accessible, and they're really only accessible in the event that we create them in. Global variables, on the other hand, are accessible everywhere. So in other programming languages, you'll create them at the top. In our programming language, you'll actually create them using a special block. But those are intended to be used everywhere. They're intended to be used for a variety of things. Objects kind of seem like variables. In our programming language, we use what's called object-oriented programming. And I know I use the word event-driven, and object-oriented is another way. But object-oriented is really about how we create things and how we access things in the program. Event-driven programming is really a method of programming that relies on events happening and then responding to events, which can include objects or cannot, or doesn't have to include objects. Usually it does. In our programming language, we have objects. These objects, even though we kind of think of them as their own variables, they're really a collection of variables. And what it means is that there's all these variables that relate to this one thing, and therefore we give that thing a name, and now we call it an object. And this is true of any programming language that uses object-oriented programming. They call it, their objects are collections of variables. So we access those using a certain notation. In our case, we can use what's called dot notation, which means you give the variable name, you put a dot, and then you give the variable name, and then you can access the variable that way. There are other ways of accessing your variables. We can use certain blocks to access those variables and get those values and store them in another variable. But if we want to access them directly, we can simply by using dot notation. So let's see what variables look like in action. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to our project, and we're going to what we're going to do is we're going to actually create a new object, and then we're going to make a score and show the score on the screen as we collect those objects. So I'm going to actually add another sprite. We're going to add an apple. Rename, so let's rename it. SPR apple. And I'm going to go ahead and import a sprite from that. We'll import from the same space that we imported last time, which is just our maze game assets, and we'll grab the apple from there. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and change its origin to middle center, just like I did with the smiley object or smiley sprite. And then of course we need to create an object for it. Obj apple, and right now we're not going to do much with the apple other than oops, we're going to set the sprite first though. Other than when the smiley hits the apple, we will destroy it. So we're going to add a collision event with obj smiley, and we're going to scroll down here until we find destroy instance. We're just going to drag that over. So destroy instance just means I'm going to destroy this instance, the instance of this variable when the smiley runs into that instance. Because with objects, I could have more than one instance of an object in a room. So for example, I'm going to go to my room right now, and I'm going to add a bunch of apples. And I can either click and drag a bunch of apples over, or I can press and hold the Alt key and put apples all over the place. Okay. And again, we're just using this to create, to like practice concepts and learn about things. So I'm not really making a game out of this. I'm just making a bunch of apples everywhere. And then I'm going to go back to the smiley object, because in the smiley object we're going to first of all create a variable. So that'll be in the create event. When we say create a variable, we're going to use that same assign variable brick or block that we used, but this time instead of assigning the value of a variable that already exists, we're going to assign a variable or create a variable by giving it a name. So we're going to call it player underscore score. And that way we can keep track of the player's score. We're going to assign it the variable of 0 to begin with, and that way the score will start at 0, and then we can add to it each time we hit an apple. Now, because I've created this in the SPR or the obj smiley object, I can only access it in the obj smiley object or going through the obj smiley object. So even if I add an event, like I add the collision event with the apple, I can update the variable by clicking and dragging assign variable over, and I just put the variable name in here, which was player underscore score. Did I accidentally delete? Nope, I didn't. Okay. So player underscore score is there, right? And you should see it start appearing when I type, right? And then the value, though, instead of setting the value to 0, I'm going to put a 1 there, and then I'm going to click relative. So we have two ways we can change a variable, and this is true for any programming language. We can either straight up change its value to some other value, whether that's a numerical value that we already know, or whether that's a value that's held in another variable. We could do that. So that's one option. We can straight up change the value. It just takes whatever value's in there, takes it out, and puts a new value in. But we can also modify the current value that's there by adding or subtracting from it. So adding to it, subtracting from it. What that allows us to do is that allows us to use the current value and then update it by some means, right? In other programming languages, you would simply use the variable on both sides of some assignment operator, because on the left side of an assignment operator is always going to be what value or what variable we're going to assign the value to, and then on the right is going to be some value. And we can borrow the current variable value and use it to create a new value. In our case, the way we're doing it is all we need to do is click this relative box. If we didn't click the relative box, whatever values here would replace whatever's in player score currently. So if I didn't change this, or I didn't click the relative value, and I just put a 1 here, even though we would collect multiple apples, our score would remain at 1 because we keep resetting whatever value's in there to 1. But when we click relative, it means that we want to use the value 1, but we want it relative to the current score, which really means we want to add 1 to the player score, and that shows up here. So adding 1 to the player score will increase it by 1 every time, so that we change the value over time as we collect apples. Now there's only one more thing we need to do, and that's actually make the score appear when we collect apples, and we always have to do that if we're going to see a variable on screen. It's the easiest way to check that our variables are working. So we're going to go to the draw event, and there's something special about the draw event that we need to know in GameMaker. As soon as you add a draw event, you have to make sure you draw the current sprite. So you have to add a draw self. If you don't add a draw self, you will not see the object sprite on screen. This has to happen. It has to do with how the program or how the IDE is written, and the fact that if we add the draw event controls all the drawing. If we add the draw event, then we have to draw ourself. That's required. It's not assumed. If you don't have the draw event, you don't need to add it and add a draw self because it'll automatically draw, and we've seen that. So now we're going to draw a value, and I'm going to add that over here. And our caption is going to be score, so we're going to give it a score. And then the value is player_score, because that's the value I want to use. That's the variable that holds the value I want to see. And we're going to leave x and y at 0, 0. That'll put it up in the upper left corner. Right now, without changing any alignment, the alignment is automatically aligned to the top left corner of the coordinates I give. So if I give 0, 0, that's where the top left corner of my score caption is going to be, which is exactly what I want. So now I can play my game or run my program, and I should be able to move around and collect the apples and have the score update, because we're adding to the score variable in our program. There we go, and you'll see up in the upper corner here, you'll notice the score is changing every time that I get an apple. And that's because I've updated the variable using the assign variable block and using the relative checkbox, so that I add 1 to the score every time I collect it. And so that variable is updating, and then I use the variable just by naming it, and using its name wherever I want to use it. So kind of a quick recap, we can assign variables a value straight up, right? We give the name, and we give the value, and we don't click relative. We can also change the value of a variable by clicking the relative box and adding whatever value is in the value box to the variable's value that's already in there. And then we can use a variable by using the name wherever we want to use it. So in this case, we wanted to draw the score value on the screen, so I just used, for value, I just put player score or player_score, because that's the variable that holds the value I want to see on screen. And as it updates, the screen is going to update as well.